In 1985, the Disney film Return to Oz was released in cinemas, and a few years later, it was made its way onto home VHS. I can't remember how old I was at the time I seen it. Perhaps 5 years old at most. I knew right away that there was something unusual about the film. Something especially disturbing. I remember that first time I seen it, I cried. I remembered watching the film, glued in place in front of the television, not out of involvement, but out of terror. Truth be told, it's a bloody scary film. Now, before you groan and go read something else, don't worry, this story isn't about a haunted videotape. The film itself played out perfectly normally, as much as possible. Dorothy didn't turn to the camera and start screaming while blood poured from her eyes or anything stupid like that. I'm not interested in telling you in stupid stories like you've read 100 times before. I just want to tell you how I felt when I watched this video, and some of the strange things that it reminded me about. It was a strange story, and I really wonder quite what the producer, Paul Magalski, was thinking at the time. I knew that the power behind the film didn't rest with him. Instead, it rested with the film's director, Walter Murch, a specialist in sound editing. Murch worked on editing films for films like The Godfather and Apocalypse now, but Return to Oz was his only venture into directing. I keep thinking that something might have happened to him during the production of this film. Maybe something that pulled him off directing any films from then onwards. But that's just a guess. My mother got a copy of the film on VHS. I remember distinctly because she also had a copy of the old Judy Garland musical version. She loved that film. I was somewhat impressed with it. The SEPA opening for a child who used to color television seemed boring to me. I didn't care for the dancing and the witch didn't impress me. All the sets just looked too false, and I found myself not appreciating the film. My mother, though, loved it. When I was an adult, she told me about the Judy Garland's drug addiction and her gradual fall from Hollywood's grace. A story that felt equally tragic to anything to silver screen. Return to Oz, however, wasn't a sequel. In fact, it was the only thing that connected to the musical version was the presence of the ruby slippers, which are silver in the original book, but my mother was still excited to see it. She had to ask a friend to find her a copy of the film, and we had to watch it. The film tells a story about Dorothy's return to the wonderful land of Oz, or at least it should be wonderful, but it really isn't. But she's desperate to go back, and when she met her first in the film, she was very depressed, miserable, and lonely. The very first image we have is ever in the film, in her staring sadly into a dirty mirror. Before long, her family had to take her to the hospital. At the hospital, which it transpires to more of an asylum, Dorothy is introduced to a doctor, keen to try out the newly invented electric healing machine, and the doctor introduces Dorothy to it, pointing out the machine's features. Here, he explains, pointing to the voltage mirror, it's its mouth, and here, he explains, pointing to the switch that sent crackling shocks of electricity searing through the young girl's skull, is his nose. She is escorted down to the bowels of the hospital, through a tall, towering hallways, and locked within a barren, empty cell. That night she is strapped onto a hospital bed, and with its screams of other inmates echoed throughout the hospital, is secured into the electric machine. As a storm rages outside, and soon knocks out the hospital's power, during which Dorothy is rescued by yet another young girl. Together they flee into the river at the banks of the hospital, and they drowned. Dorothy returns to the land of Oz. She journeys there in ruins of an old crate, floating down the river. That's the way the story goes. But not all that happens in the old Wizard of Oz film, the one with Judy Garland. Dorothy's house is plucked out from the farm by a hurricane. We all know that hurricanes don't move people from one location and drop them, gently and carefully, down in another. If it had been a real person, caught in a small wooden farmhouse in the winds of hurricane, Dorothy would have died, and maybe she did, and the rest of the film was all simply a hallucination, with her fevered, frantic brain. No, that's just a fury. In this film, Return to Oz, Dorothy falls into the churning waters of the river, struggling to stay above its surface, her arms splashing and her mouth gasping for air. And then she's in Oz. And for a few moments, everything seems fine. Everything seems quite happy. She finds a talking chicken called Belina, who offers to travel with her on the way to Emerald City. Along the way, she finds a tree which just droops lunch boxes, filled with already made sandwiches. It's almost like everything may turn out alright once they get to Emerald City, because she'll be able to get back to her farm. Her farm where she sat staring into the dirty mirror, her eyes heavily with despair. David Kerr of the Chicago Reader described this film as bleak, creepy, and occasionally terrifying. You don't want Dorothy to go home, not into the world of doctors who want to rip the happiness from her, from the nurses who tied her down, from the towering hallways and electric machines with wide grinning mouths. Down the river. Soon Dorothy finds her old farmhouse, the one which she crashed during her previous visit to Oz. It sits there in an overgrown forest, no cheery dancing munchkins to be found around here. Only wild vines and twisted trees. Dorothy wipes the dust that had etched its way over the windows, trying to see inside. She finds the yellow brick road, only to realize it's been uprooted, its bricks broken and shattered. The land that she wanted to go back is twisted, nightmarish, and hostile. The old farmhouse. I grew up in the small village in the rural areas of Cornwall. We had farms around the landscape, and I could climb up one of the small, gently sloping hills and look out into the horizon, and only to see fields of wheat as far as it went. That was my Kansas. I think it was late summer when I found the old farmhouse. I'd gone out to explore, despite my father's instruction to stay in our house's garden. I'd hiked the way over to the crumbling stone wall that bordered our garden, and had made our way to the fields, venturing as far as I could before the sun would set. I avoided the fields with the crows and great towering things, and the clouds above me gradually began to grow dark and pentuous. I'd gone further than I had before, keen to examine the small corps of trees in the distance that I had never seen before. It was there, down near the foot of the hill, that seemed an old farmhouse for just the first time. I'd hurried down the house and ran up the windows. They were etched with dirt. I could barely see anything through them. I stood up on my tiptoes, trying to look into them, and could only make out a brownish haze. I scrubbed the windows, and I was able to make out the inside of the house. It was a disarray. Chairs tipped over and table lying broken in the corner. I could only make out a doorway leading into another room, but whatever lay through was out of sight. It wasn't the same house. The layout was different with the ruins inside it. They were different. But in and of itself, the house was almost a perfect fit. It was like my own version of Dorothy's ruined farmhouse. Transported here was not far from my home. I wanted to get inside. I don't know why. Perhaps simply because it was there, or perhaps because I wanted to get further than Dorothy did in the film. I pried the window open and, under the house, where the witch lies dead, crawled inside. It felt warm, as if the air itself was hot. There was a soft hum in the air, which I soon realized they were coming from a few buzzing insects. It felt stuffy, as if the summer heat was magnified and made it heavy. There were no lights, or if there were, the lights would not come on. The room was dyed a soft reddish brown from the dust on the windows. I crept across the house stands on top of the dead, which she rots beneath. The wooden floorboards, and surely enough they creaked beneath me. I looked into the doorway to the other room, and I found it had led to the kitchen. Several items lay in the sink, cutlery and sharp edges. I started to feel sick. I didn't want to be here. The air tasted wrong. There was a smell, something I never smelled before, but I knew it was bad. I turned to leave and wanted to run, but I heard a heavy sound at the doorway, and it was a footstep. The figure stood in the doorway. A man. The house is marked with death. As it sours from below, the witch has left her body broken. Stood blocking the sunlight. He wore a thick, heavy brown coat, the kind most farmers in the area should wear, but his beard was thick and mottled with hot wire wool. His hair hung dense from clumps, and he stares at me with eyes, sharp and brutal eyes, with utterly intense hatred. He towered above me, a small child about 6 years old. This giant figure. He was holding something in his right hand. I couldn't see what, only that was a sharp and pointed stain with mud. It had to be mud. The man opened his mouth and roared at me, his teeth crooked behind his mane like a beard, releasing every echo of the broken house with his words, "Get out." I ran. I turned and ran out of the house, charging through the kitchen and pulling myself through the window and out into the field. I didn't slow down for a second. I tripped and fell in the mud at the base of the window, but I didn't stop. I kept running. I didn't look back. I ran over the field and went through the trees. I was gasping for air and my legs hurt, but I didn't stop running. Not until I got home. I didn't notice it was dark and that the sun had set and that the dark of the night had covered the village. I slammed the door shut, blocking out the man and the broken farmhouse forever. My father came downstairs when he heard me slam the door, demanded to know where I had been and what was I doing. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want to tell him, so I lied. He demanded some more ardently, telling me that it was late and that he knew I was lying. When I eventually did tell him, he marched me up to the bedroom, ordered me to lower my pants, and lay over my bed. When he removed his belt and thrashed my butt until I was screaming and crying rapidly. He made me a promise on the threat of the same punishment, that being delivered again, that I would not sneak into people's houses again. I was still sore for most of the next day. That I would not sneak into other people's houses again. I was still sore for the next day, and I had no idea until years later as to why he had grown so angry with me. When I did find out, it was in my teenage years. Our family had moved away from the village into a small house in a large city. The change had been considerable, not just in terms of the building, but of a new lifestyle. It became impossible to avoid hearing about the world around us, and I no longer had my parents' continual presence to shelter me from the information that you could find out in the newspaper or the internet. It was on the evening news I had seen the photograph of the man in the old farmhouse. The reporter explained that he had died in the prison, serving his life sentence for the murder of 4 young children, all aged between 4 and 9 years old. He had been arrested a month after my dad had taken his belt to me and made me a promise not to venture into people's houses again. In prison, he had took his own life. The news didn't say how. I later learned that he had broken off a sharp edge of his toothbrush and swallowed it, slicing open his throat. He choked to death on his own blood. Dorothy continued down the yellow brick road, ruins of the brick road, and so did I. When Dorothy arrived at the Emerald City, she finds all of her friends, but they've been turned into stone. They stand around the ruins of Emerald City, their bodies lifeless. The city is abandoned, with only their bodies left gray and stoic. The Emerald City was a mausoleum, but it's not unoccupied. In one of the most terrifying moments of the film, we meet the living occupants of the city. It tumbles into view, moving our 4 legs, each leg ending with a screeching rusty reel. At first we see its face as black and twisted mass of tissue and muscle, corrupted into a manacled grimace. Eyes peered out with the cold, biting glare. It lifts up its head, revealing that the previous face was simply a false one. Its true face hiding beneath it, it laughs. "Come here!" It raps in a guttural scream. It laughs, and more of them appear. 3, 4, a whole gang. Dorothy flees, and I could only clutch my hands to my eyes. I was hoping to block them out just to make the nightmarish creatures go away. Dorothy finds locked in the old chamber of the Emerald City a manacled guardian called Tick-Tock, who offers to protect her from the wielded monsters. The creature has its own manacled face, much like the one from the electric shock machine back in the hospital in Kansas. But it's Dorothy's friend, and fights off the Wheelers, discovers that the city has been taken over by an evil witch called Mombi. Tick-Tock isn't terrifying. He's a friendly, analytical character. The same cannot be said for all of Dorothy's friends, but we'll get to that. First, we need to talk about Mombi. I didn't recognize her as a child, but when I first watched the film, but Mombi was played by Jean Marsh, who also played the nurse that strapped Dorothy in her hospital bed at the start of the film, who chased Dorothy into the river to meet her fate. She was, for 5 years, married to John P. Pertwee, the actor who famously portrayed the third incarnation of Doctor Who, and perhaps more relevant to the story, played by the character Wuzzle Grummudge, the scarecrow who brought to life. I mentioned the scarecrow because Dorothy's other companion is a prisoner of Mombi's. When Mombi traps Dorothy in her tower, the young girl from Kansas meets one of Mombi's failed experiments, Jack Pumpkinhead. Jack is a terrifying creature, taller than any other actor in the film, with its thick limbs which seem to go on forever. It stands unsteadily on its long legs, wearing a tattered, old, discolored coat. Its fingers ending with the long, wrenching branches. At the top of his neck lays a pumpkin in the place of the head. When the creature moves, it does so in sharp, sudden jerks, pulling its hands along as if they were alien parts of its body. Its voice was sickly sweet, provided by Brian Henson. Brian Henson is the son of the famous Jim Henson, and is now a chairman of the Jim Henson Company. His voice is certainly the softest, otherwise terrifying creature. If you've ever seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, you might find some interesting similarities with the film's lead character. And at several points throughout the film, Jack's limbs will break and fall apart, having to be bound back in place with rope. Dorothy's only way to escape from Mombi's tower is to steal the powder of life, which the witch used to bring the pumpkin-headed creature to life. She stores the powder in the glass cabinet, along with her spare heads. Yes, Mombi has a collection of heads. She changes them to fit her mood. They sit in the cabinets, looking for all the purpose to be asleep, but each head is very much alive. That night when Dorothy attempts to steal the powder of life from the cabinet, she accidentally awakens one of the disembodied heads, and its eyes sharp awake, its raspy voice screams the girl's name. Dorothy Gale! The other heads were awake and start to scream. They scream and scream and screamed. Their echoing cries awoke with the witch herself, who rose to her bed, nightgown flowing like a scepter. The space in the shoulders where the head used to be was utterly vacant. The headless figure stumbled towards the young girl, arms outstretched, and while the head screamed, a terrible illusion. We'd been at the city for a year. I had been enrolled into a new school. It was far larger than I was accustomed to, and some of the boys that started the school year had been brutally mocking. I was labeled as a farm boy and treated as an outsider. Over the course of the months, though, they had forgotten about my difference, and soon I was simply the other of one of the school kids. I'd seen him at the schoolyard. I didn't know his name, but he was a bright kid with a splash of sunlight blonde hair. I think he must have been about 11 years old, but to my young eyes, he could have been older by an infinite number of years. He was a big kid. As a big kid, I tried to avoid him, because he and his friends were lauded as prosperous. He was upper years of school, and as a result, he didn't have to wear his uniform. None of the upper years did. So did the big kid, who had to wear whatever he wanted, usually a white t-shirt and jeans. I don't think he's ever spoken to me. I barely even noticed him, but because of what happened, I remembered him. It was summer and I was off of school during the start of the summer holidays. It could have been more than a week since school had stopped, and it was just a few more weeks before we were due to head away to the seaside to spend our holiday in the sun. It was already a nice day. The sun was warm and it was a cool wind. Dorothy Gale in my hair. My mother had taken me to the city to the center that day. She wanted to pick up a few items from the large post office, where the packages were sorted. I was feeling rather sour, as my mother's venture out to do daily shopping had interrupted my time for watching morning cartoons. Nevertheless, I had shrugged along, the promise that if I behaved, would rent out a film from the video rental store that morning. It had been a long time since we rented out The Return to Oz, and the film had faded from my memory. I was excited. I was keen to see what we could find in that dark little video rental store. My mother was already certain that she wanted to rent out the Judy Garland musical version of The Wizard of Oz to relive her love of classic. This was years before blockbusters came to England. The video rental stores were small stores owned by enterprising individuals looking to break into a new market. My mother parked the car just a few yards from the store, and we got out. The wind was starting to pick up, and it was starting to feel a little cold. I grabbed my coat from my backseat of the car and put it on. My mother looked over to me and said, "I'm going to pop into the bakery for a moment." The bakery, I should mention, was on the other street corner from 2 stores from the video rental shop, with a small barber shop between the two. "Wait here," she indicated, to the front of the video store. I waited. I wasn't going to argue, and I certainly wasn't going to disobey. The promise of watching a new film that evening was enough to ensure me that I have waited for what looked like an age. But I was sure that no more than a minute, when I heard the sounds of shouts from the other side of the street. I looked over. It was the big kid with his white t-shirt and jeans, and his bright blonde hair shining, especially bright in the summer sun. He was on his bicycle, along with 3 other friends. I recognized all of them from school, but they were just like a big kid. I didn't even know their names, and they were shouting to each other, and circling around on their bikes, doing small tricks. Being one of the big kid's friends would make his bike hop back and forth. Another would swerve on his wheel, standing up on the pedals. The road was quiet. After about a minute, the group moved onto the road, riding around the parked cars. It was a peaceful morning, about 11 o'clock, and the boys were cheering. One of them made his bike hop into the pavement, spinning on the handlebars as he did so. Not a single sound broke the summer day. I watched the big kid and his friend doing tricks for a moment. When I turned to look at the window of the video rental store, the windows was full of posters. I was curious to see what they were advertising. I looked to another, barely noticing the sunlight dimmed somewhat as a cloud passed through the sun. The light brush of the wind felt a bit colder, so I wrapped my arms around myself and waited for my mother. When I heard one of the big kid's friendlies cries out, the truck must have taken down the turn of the road too fast, and I didn't see it turn, but when I heard the cry, I turned to look and seen it tearing down the road. It was a huge truck, massive, towering, and ferocious. Its carriage smashed into one of the cars on the far side of the road. The boys on the street started to run in panic in their steps. One dropped his bike and ran on his feet instead, the scream of the truck's brakes suffocating his own scream. The big kid did not move. I don't know why he didn't move at the time. I realized now he was rooted by his spot of fear. His shirt whistled around him, and he stared at the truck, eyes wide, mouth open, a scream echoing from his mouth. He had tried to raise his hands to cover his face, as if his thin arms would defend him from the mophatic 10-wheeled truck that was charging out of control towards him. He was screaming and screaming and screaming. The truck bore down the street, even though it was almost 30 foot down from where I was standing. I felt the air hit me in a hard gust as it charged down the big kid. The truck didn't even collide with him. It simply poured over to where he stood, his body buckling underneath it, folding it like it was made out of paper. His head at the height of the top of the wheels, it was tore free. There wasn't much blood, but the force of the truck colliding with the big kid ripped the boy's head from its shoulders and sent it hurtling across the road. The big kid's head struck the road, and suddenly it was nothing more than a hunk of meat, like a prop in a movie. I wasn't screaming. I couldn't. My throat simply didn't make a sound, except for a series of wheezing and gasps. I tried to pull enough air into my lungs, but I couldn't scream, because I couldn't breathe. But there was screaming in the air. I couldn't figure out who it was screaming. Then I realized it was the head, the big kid's head, swaying lightly as it was the other side of the road, in the gutter, emptying its last sounds from the ruin of his throat, an awful scream that rattled from the severed neck, just for a few short seconds. The truck had stopped where it was. It was brakes bringing to a stop and all too late, but beneath it were the wheels of the big kid's body, twitched for a few moments before, his arms splaying out on the last moments of his muscle memory, as he tries to feel around the empty air beneath his shoulders. The witch kept a collection of heads. She changed them and would wear a different one depending on her mood, and after a few short terrible seconds, the movement ceased. The screaming stopped. The big kid, who less than a minute before living like a person, was rendered into pieces by unmoving matter. Human meat, broken apart and empty. My mother ran from the bakery and pulled me out of the way, hoping that moving me out of the scene would push what I had seen out of my mind. But that didn't work. I closed my eyes, but the image didn't go away. I could still see the big kid's head, from the side of his face ripped and caved inwards like a dessert bowl. His eyes were in the wrong place, and his mouth was open as he let all fell the echoes of his scream. Dorothy, of course, had fled down from the witch's twitching, lurching body as her collection of screeching heads. She had to run away and escape the horrors, but wasn't quite so lucky. Some of the things I couldn't escape from. They would hold me in place in existence, in space between the blinking of my eyes. With the powder of life, Dorothy was able to grow together a small mass of assorted items in the witch's tower. A sofa, a moose's head, and other random junk, brought to life, creating an assorted mishmash of a creature. It was called a gump, and like Jack Pumpkinhead, it was a jumble homunculus of items. Dorothy flew away on the winged gump, following and flying across the Deadly Desert. The Deadly Desert, a mass of sand at the border of Oz, which if you so much touch the sand, it would cause you to turn into sand yourself. Several of the wheelers pursued Dorothy, and when their wheels touched the sand, they collapsed. Their bodies yellowed, cracked, and fell apart, their bodies swifting in the wind, lines and curves on their faces, shattering and breaking apart. The gump rips apart in its air, its wings breaking, and Dorothy and her friends crash land into the mountain of the Gnome King, a sinister creature formed of a living rock. The Gnome King was played by an Austrian stern Doragom Nicol Williamson, a Scottish actor who forged his way through many respected Shakespeare roles and stage on screen. Before his death in 2011, Williamson also played the doctor from the hospital back in Kansas. That both the sinister doctor and his beastly assistant have been incarnated in Oz. Actors all make sense. It all makes sure that the dark and sinister Oz of this film is but a flash of Dorothy's memory as she drowns in the river during the storm. No, she doesn't drown. No matter how many times I tried to remind myself of that story, I keep thinking that she drowned. I've never seen the film many times as an adult, and yet each time I watched it, I find myself thinking as she falls into the churning waters of the river. It is here at the point she drowns. I know my consciousness of my mind that she doesn't, but each time I think back on this film. I remember Dorothy slipping beneath the flashing waves, her wet skin wet, cold, and gasping for air, drowning the breath in the weight of the water. No, Dorothy does not drown. That's not the story in the film. I keep remembering the film indifferently. I keep thinking that she drowns, but she doesn't. She doesn't drown. Dorothy does not drown. She does go to the land of Oz and rescues her friends, who have been captured by the Gnome King. She goes into the Gnome King's treasure chamber, and where she turned all of her friends into ornaments, and she brings them back to life. Little Fuzza Balk, in her first film role, she hadn't drowned when she went on to be Stacy in American History X. She didn't drown. She brings them all back to Emerald City, and the Gnome King dies. The witch Mombi is captured by the heroes, but the Gnome King dies. Dorothy's companion, the talking chicken called Bellina, drops an egg into the Gnome King's mouth. The Gnome King at this point of the film having to be a gigantic creation of rocks and gags and chokes. He rasps the words, "Eggs! Poison!" and crumbles. His entire body breaks apart, slowly chunks of rock falling away, taking his face with it. Eggs. Poison. Of course the eggs are not poison in the film. They're only poisonous to the Gnome King. I never understood why, but when I did as an adult, I didn't realize the connection purely to the Gnome King, and not something that would affect any of the other characters, human or otherwise. The statement was simply a proclamation, a warning. Eggs. Poison. Wizard's face turned into rock, churned, boiled, and fell apart like pebbles. Poison. My mother served me a plate of scrambled eggs for lunch. This was 2 weeks before we moved into the city, away from our village home. I have lived in the village my entire life, and we had no more than 30 buildings of a single main street with local shop, pub, schoolhouse, and church. Surrounded as we were by farmland, a large number of our local produce was horticultural. Local beef, pork, and eggs. I pushed away the plate. "Not hungry?" asked my mother. I shook my head. Poison. I found the nest during the summer. It was hidden in the roots of an oak tree. It was near the back of the church hall. It had been built by some stray of chickens, who had nestled down amongst the gnarled and twisted old roots and the not rotting tree. I had found it one morning. Winston made our way to school, and it had been raining the night before. My rubber Wellington boots were fleckled with mud. I was the sound I heard first, a bleating cry. I stepped through the soggy grass and leaned closer, peering enough into the shadows of the old tree roots. The nest was wet and full of dirt. 2 chicken eggs sat in the dirt, their surfaces glistening from the rain. The third egg lay in pieces. Bits of its shell hung like a deflated balloon. The infant chicken had been born too early, and it was premature to be half-formed. Its body looked like a wet mass of string. Its skin was oily and black. It seemed to be made of muscle fiber. Its head was too big for its neck, and hung limply to one side. Its eyes opened far too wide, as if twitching itself on the string, trying to breathe, struggling to live. The rest of it's only partly there. Its premature birth, a fetus and a creature, more muscle and tissue than life. Its eggs and cracked into piled of click and chicken to the world, rejecting it. Poison. We didn't have a cafeteria at school. It was too small a building. Instead, the local store would send us to a van back of the schoolhouse, where the teachers would collect our meals and bring them to the gym hall. It was also doubled as an auditorium. Despite being significantly too small to qualify as one, we sat and ate our lunches. Those who got lunches from the school van who always brought a packed lunch altogether. My mother made me some ham sandwiches, with crusts neatly cut off. I sat in the other tree, 3 other kids in my class. Chris was a keen football fan, and would usually rush through his lunch in order to finish early so we could hurry into the yard and kick a ball around for a while. Josh was quiet, bookish of sort, who had long black hair and had a set of strong braces, which shone against one time when he smiles. And then there was Gary, who didn't speak much, but followed the rest of us around quite eagerly. I chewed on my sandwich for a while, not really speaking. Chris was talking eagerly about the football match he had been watched on television that night. I didn't care about football, and his descriptions of kicks and goals seemed to be like an alien luggage to me. He took a bite out of his sandwich and continued to walk, spraying bits of food as he did so. I turned to Josh, wanting to tell him about the other nest I found. I told him about the chick, laying squirming in the muddy ground, grasping for life. Josh shook his head. "All chickens were little when they're born," he said. I tried to explain that it wasn't simply a baby chick, but it was a half-formed and dying. But I was only a child and couldn't form the description properly. At best, I could explain that it has been born wrong. Chris had took another bite out of his sandwich and made a small coughing sound. Josh had said maybe a fox found its nest and was eating some of these eggs, and maybe it left the baby dead chick behind. I tried to explain that it might have been possible, when Chris coughed again. I turned to look at him. His face looked round, brighter, and puffier. He coughed again and again, louder and in motion towards his throat. The other kids from nearby turned to notice as Chris, coughing, become more insistent. He dropped his sandwich and he had gotten from the lunch van. It fell open, slices of bread separating showed the creamy white shade of its contents. Egg mayonnaise. Chris stood up, tried to stand up, but he couldn't, tripping over as he did so. Josh rushed forward, trying to slap him on the back. "Help!" he cried out. Chris was clasping his throat now. His face was flushing from the deeper to pale red to a deeper, more blood shade. He was growing frantic and began to panic. He was wheezing for the air and breath, trying desperately to fill his lungs, but he couldn't. Without any air, he would drown or choke to death. But that wasn't right. That wasn't what's killing him. I knew it was what was killing him. It was the poison. The eggs in the sandwich. The teacher was running over, but Chris had fallen to the floor at this point, his rasping gasp for air, and in a small hall. He twitched, thrashing for his air, his skin turning to a darker shade of red, and I thought about the chick, which was doing the very same. I grabbed the teacher's arm and said, "It's the eggs," and instantly my eyes stinging as I felt tears with them. The eggs! They're poisoned! Chris had been taken to the local doctor's clinic. They found the obstruction in his throat, a large piece of eggshell, almost the size of a small coin, which had burrowed deep in the sharp edge of the side of his throat. I don't think the film was cursed. The whole cursed movie thing does not work. In reality, it may have been the director's only movie, but it doesn't mean anything was unnatural. I don't think the video I watched was haunted. No, definitely it isn't the movie that was haunted. It was me. By the time she goes back to Kansas, Dorothy's journey is over. She had found the rightful heir to the throne of Oz and helped to reclaim the world. We had learned that the hospital burned to the ground during the storm, and the doctor died in the fire. Burned to death. The Gnome King died, and so did the doctor. Both characters, both played by the same actor, met their fate, but Dorothy was home, and she was wiser and more confident now. Her sadness was gone. She could only carry the memory of Oz with her forever. I wondered if that was a curse as well. Poor little Dorothy Gale wouldn't forever return to Oz. I stood on the road where the truck had struck and killed the blonde-haired kid. This was about a month ago. I was in the city for business. I had just finished a new project, shooting a new film. When I was 12, I watched a movie called Cinema Paradiso, a classic modern Italian movies that followed the story of a man who grows up in a small village, who at the local cinema had a major impact of his life. He grows up to become a respected film director. There were similarities between our lives. I had finished my 5th feature film, and I had begun to wonder just what kind of an influence the film had I watched as a kid from what it had on me, and how it shaped me into who I was. The character from the Cinema Paradiso is blustered by these. They give me the strength and the means of escape. For me, there was one film that terrified me, and that's what brought me back to the street, where the big kid had died in the truck accident. It was only a coincidence that had brought me here. I had 2 weeks ago on editing would begin on the film, and I needed a break, a way to clear my head. The editing was due to take place in the main studio, but by sheer coincidence, my hotel wasn't too far from the truck accident that occurred. That evening I walked down to the street. I thought that maybe it looked the same. I didn't really know what I hoped to find. I didn't want to drown out my memories. Maybe just want to see them one last time, in order to say goodbye. The video rental store was long since gone. The bakery was still there though. The young man behind the counter told me that he couldn't remember the video rental store being here on the street ever since he had moved to the city. Some 7 years ago, time had changed. I had expected to still see marks from the tires from the truck on the road. I didn't. No black scorch of burned rubber, and no dash of blood in the gutter where the head had landed. The city had changed. It had moved on. The only memory remained. There was one last piece I had to go. My home village in Cornwall had changed perhaps more drastically. I drove down a narrow white sedan, and I pulled up to the village's main street. I realized that time had vanished since the place was far worse than Hurricane Wood. I was determined not to let the weight of some dissociate me from what I intended to do, though I parked my car and looked around. I tasted the air and looked around. I had driven through the small hills, which were once full of wheat, but were now empty. My Kansas was gone. The air tasted different. This, I thought, was my own return to Oz. The post office was shut. It had closed many years ago. The small corner shop was now a Safeway, and even it was a small one with the only single checkout. I went to the local pub, and which I had never done when I was a child there. The man behind the counter took notice of me. All around the people seemed old, as if history had chewed on them and left their wrinkled faces gaunt. I couldn't see any children there. The bartender told me that there weren't really young families around here anymore. No work around here, it seemed. The only people who had once worked on the farms, waiting for the dust of earth to reclaim them. Being the village was so painful, it felt like a relic, something that the past had forgotten. Time had moved on. I had moved on. The village had not. It had struggled. It had lost. I didn't want to stay for too long. I knew that I wanted to make this quick, before coming here too painful, before the ghosts of my memories began to hurt me. I left the pub and started my walk. The school was the closest, so I went there first. It was a poor decision. The building itself was barren. The sign at the front with the school's name had once been boldly etched onto it. It had been taken down. The building was abandoned. Without any children to teach, there was no use at the school anymore. I had learned from the man who owned the local pub in the hall, where Chris had choked on the broken piece of eggshell so many years before. It was occasionally used for the village and meetings, but the classrooms had long since abandoned. I walked around the building, peering into the rooms. They were all barren, emptied of furniture, no desks, no chairs. One held an old blackboard, its surface covered with dust. When I got to the church, I realized before I even stepped into the yard that the old oak tree was long gone. I found an old priest with the shock of dirty white hair, tending to the front of the church. When I asked him about the tree, he told me that it had caught a disease several years before it was cut down. I walked into the yard and sure enough, found the old dry patch of the ground where a tree once stood. The ground felt harder than the soil surrounding it, and it rose steadily lump, like a despoiled grave. The old farmhouse had been demolished. It had been concreted over, even to prevent anyone else from building using it. At the foot of the hill, a large square patch of gray concrete was almost out amongst the tall tree grass. I had stumbled across it, because the years had pushed the details location from my head. When I found the patch of concrete, I half expected to find a small plaque as well, perhaps a dedication to our 4 children that had been murdered and buried there. There wasn't one. The concrete itself was cracked and old by then, with bits of weed and long grass peeking it through its nature's own fingertips. It was almost as if the world like that wants to forget. I tried to forget. The journey had been painful, bittersweet. I felt that it had made my homecoming, and felt a little sadness that it would bring. I just wanted to leave. Soon the memories were too strong, the ones that were powerful for me, and the rest of the world had done its best to forget it. I had made my journey, or so I thought, but it wasn't done yet. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the river. I don't know what brought me there. I had no idea what guided my steps. I had forgotten the village had a river. In the daylight, I thought the river might look beautiful, but with the sun staring at the dye and the dark red and slipped downwards towards the horizon, made its undercurrents with the water look dark. My feet had brought me down there, almost unbidden, as if I was following the trail, but was laid out for me a long time ago. This is where my broken, ruined, yellow brick road leads me. And that's when I remembered. This is where she drowned. I don't remember it all at once. The images came along first. Her eyes were with green and wide with terror, the water splashing over her skin, making it glisten. Her mouth was full and unable to take enough air. Her short black hair slick against the scalp and utter disarray. The water kept washing over her face, the dark cloak of her current covering for her few fleeting moments before she broke the surface again, only to dip back into its icy embrace again. I was on the bank of the river. I was clasping into her arm, but it was cold winter's night, and her coat was too wet. I was wearing gloves and she kept slipping. I couldn't hold on. I couldn't get a good grip. I wasn't strong enough. I was only 6 years old, and she was 4, and the river had her on the riverbank. I knew that she would follow me forever. I couldn't leave her behind. I couldn't lock her away again. Return to Oz bound us forever. Because my mother, who had loved the Judy Garland, had named my sister Dorothy.